case. At the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, we have various training initiatives. And one of the initiatives we're very proud of is helping our partners work with privately sourced or privately held data. It is for this reason that we are very partnering with the Industry Data for Society Partnership. Our colleagues who are represented here, we have LinkedIn, Ookla, and GitHub, to try and figure out where are we headed as a world, as a universe. When we're thinking about the future work, we think about, what is going to happen to us, what is going to happen to our jobs. But then when you think about the future of work, you cannot talk about that without talking about something like AI. But for us to effectively do AI, you need very good connection, hence Ookla. And when you have good connection and good AI, you start becoming more efficient, becoming more collaborative, and creating new tools, and making super software engineers. GitHub enters the room. And when that happens, we start seeing changes in the job market. We start seeing some jobs being left behind, new jobs we never thought about coming up. And we start seeing updates in our profiles, no pressure to anyone. And all this just ends up in the world of LinkedIn. It's my pleasure to introduce Casey Weston from LinkedIn. We have Cynthia and Bridget, Ookla and GitHub, who are going to take us through the next session, sharing all the important and very interesting work that they have been doing over the years, the data that they have, and for us to have conversations about, what is out there, how can we access it, how can we use it, what is possible, and what does the future really look like? So, ladies and gentlemen, over to you, Casey Weston. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Lynette. Thank you, Anita. Thank you to the entire team at the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. We're so happy to be engaging with this really amazing group from around the world. This is a very complex call in that there are 3 different languages, probably many more spoken amongst the total group, and people from around the world joining. So we're very happy to have you here. And very grateful to the partnership for facilitating this. I'm hoping that people can access the chat or the Q&A, but I would love signals that people are receiving information in the language that they need, are, able to hear us and see the slides okay. So if you can just throw at least your name into the chat, or just throw the country that you're coming from. Yes, we love the thumbs up. Do a little emoji and the react button, whatever you need. Interpreter team, thank you so much for doing the interpretation for this group. If you're having any challenges, please go ahead and throw that into the chat so that we know that those challenges are happening, and Anita can work to try to resolve those. Okay, so without further ado, and with many thanks to you all and the partnership, we'll dive in. What we're going to do today is just do a quick introduction of who we are as this group, LinkedIn, Ookla, and GitHub. And then we will dive into some of the challenges that we've seen with regards to working with private sector data. Many of you have probably worked with private sector data before. Some of you may not have, but we are all eager. Yes, thank you for throwing in the chat. We are all eager to support your efforts to broaden the data horizons that you have. And so we'll have a little conversation about what that looks like and how to overcome some of those challenges. And then we'll walk you through the data sets that we would love to offer you all, and walk through some of the challenges and limitations of them, as well as the opportunities and how our partners have used them. So this is going to be a lot of talking, but we would love to receive some information as well. So please feel free to throw things in the questions, raise your hand, stop us, whatever you need to do. We would love for this to be as interactive as it can be with 3 languages and dozens of people on the call. Okay. So I'll just do a quick introduction of LinkedIn. LinkedIn, of course, as you know it, is a a site where you can search for jobs and share your job profile, a professional networking site. But really, our vision is much broader than that. Our goal is to create economic opportunity for every member of the global workforce. And as part of this, we work with a wide array of actors because we can't accomplish this very ambitious vision alone. What this means is that we have over 1 billion members on our platform globally, and all of them share information on the companies that they work for, the job changes that they make within companies and through companies, the skills that they acquire in those experiences, and their educational backgrounds. This creates a really rich representation, digital representation of the global economy that we call the economic graph. From this economic graph, we're able to source aggregated data and insights. And these are really unique because they're global in nature. They can be broken down very granularly, and they're nearly presented in real time. So they're much faster than many administrative data sets that our government and nonprofit partners are usually working with. We found that these data are really unique because they can provide insights on labor market and workforce equity, particularly gender equity. They can show us how we are doing in terms of the green transition in talking about green skills and green jobs. And they can reveal a great deal about how the digital transformation is changing the world of work, particularly with regards to AI. So we're eager to think about how some of this data might be useful to you all, even if it's not available in the specific country in which you're living and working. Some of the insights from this platform might be useful to you. With this, I'll pass over to Bridget from UCLA.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Casey. Thanks, Data for Now, for having me. It's really exciting to be here. I am Bridget. I'm here on behalf of UCLA. I'm on our strategic initiatives team, primarily working with the UCLA for Good initiative, which I will get into a little bit later. So for a little bit of background to our company, if you are unfamiliar with UCLA, we are a global leader in connectivity intelligence. If you've ever come across one of our products, such as Ekahau, Root Metrics, Down Detector, if you've ever had to look and see if there was a online service outage, or if you've ever had to take a speed test to check your internet performance, you might be familiar with the fact that we are very connectivity oriented. Connectivity is our business. And UCLA's mission is to measure, understand, improve connected experiences worldwide and try to create better connectivity overall. And with our connectivity data, we aim to help our clients and our customers efficiently solve their biggest connectivity challenges and drive forward innovation. So if we can get to the next slide, and I can give a pretty high level overview of the data we have. So our data is crowdsourced and global. We have over 10 million daily consumer-initiated tests taken on speed test. We actually hit 50 billion total speed tests last fall, which was very exciting. We are represented in 100% of the world's countries. And we have billions of coverage scans taken on speed test Android every day and over 50K testing servers in over 190 countries. So we have a lot of data on connectivity. Next slide, please. So because we have that level of connectivity data, and because it is so useful in analyzing networks and connectivity worldwide, we want to support efforts of those looking to improve people's lives through internet accessibility. It is pretty irresponsible for us as a company to have this mission statement of wanting connectivity for all if we are also not improving efforts worldwide and on all fronts to make connectivity available for all. So this is where UCLA for Good comes in. Through our program, we provide complementary data, insights, and tools to leading organizations and grassroots efforts seeking to accomplish the goal of improving people's lives through internet accessibility, and later on I'll show some of our case studies. This data has been used in matters of digital inequity, disasters, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic that ended up being quite an important variable as most people had to be remote and isolated and have good internet.
Amazing. With that, Bridget, yeah, thank you so much. We'll transfer over to Cynthia from GitHub.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you for inviting us to the LinkedIn team. I'm Cynthia from GitHub, and I'll talk a little bit more about what GitHub is, an introduction, and then we'll have my colleague Kevin who'll go into that data set afterwards. So on the next slide, just a quick introduction. Oh, sorry. There we go. So I'm Cynthia. I'm at GitHub. I'm a program manager and I manage partnerships with the social sector and as well as the public sector in terms of some of the programs that we have at GitHub, some of the enablement on our tools, as well as being able to help on research. And we also have Kevin, who is our one and only amazing engineer on the policy team at GitHub. We'll go over more of the data as well as the GitHub innovation graph. So on the next slide, I'll go more about overview of GitHub. All right, so GitHub is a complete developer platform. If you haven't heard about GitHub, don't worry about it. So we are a platform for engineers as well as software developers, data scientists to build, scale, and deliver secure software. And we have 100 million software developers, and it's used by over 4 million organizations, from governments for open data initiatives to international development organizations like UN agencies on building technical tools used for their beneficiaries. So a number of open source software is built on GitHub, like digital public goods, such as DHIS2 on healthcare information systems management programs. And on the next slide, a little bit more about, if you click in, sorry, I believe there's some pop-ups there, Casey, apologies. A little bit more about the GitHub experience. So in terms of what it is, it's a platform for anybody to go in and to be able to then build software together. So there's collaborative tools that are available. So we have our GitHub Copilot as well for a peer programmer, for developers to have a suggested code, as well as we have security products to make sure that the workflow is in place for secure development. And then on the next slide, we'll go a little bit more into what that platform is. We have collaboration tools for secure code management, different discussion platforms for developers to talk to each other, as well as open source developers. So in other words, for any open source initiatives and projects, any of the 10 million developers on GitHub can then help and collaborate on a specific project securely. Being able to have GitHub Copilot, which are pair programmer, to help provide suggestions on code. We have integrated continuous integration and continuous delivery with our GitHub Actions for automated workflows, as well as Codespaces, which is used for collaboration between developers wherever they are in the world. And of course, we have a layer of security to make sure the code that is being used or being uploaded is secure. There's code scanning, different tools that's available, as well as a security overview. And lastly, one of the key elements of GitHub is the community. The scale of developers that are on GitHub, organizations that have open source, especially digital public good open source products or projects, they can post that on GitHub. And we have ways to be able to highlight certain projects so the open source community can then work on specific initiatives. For instance, I mentioned digital public goods like DHIS2, or other human essential banks, for instance, or different mapping initiatives. They can post our project and have an ask out to the community to help support. I can also add the link on there for different initiatives and share that afterwards as well. All right. And then on the next slide, I believe, a very quick overview on that community that I mentioned on the developer platform. So different companies may use GitHub. Open source projects would also use GitHub. Social sector organizations, as well as a DevOps ecosystem. What that means is that there's a lot of different code, public and open source code that's on GitHub, and what GitHub can now do with a number of different requests that have come through is we want to provide that data available openly to the academia, to governments, to other researchers to take a look to see what insights they can find from all that data and all that code that's flowing through GitHub. And we're going to dig a little bit more into that with Kevin later on. And then now I'm going to pass it back to Casey for the next section.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Cynthia. So first, my amazing co-presenters, Bridget and Cynthia, did such a good job introducing themselves. I was so eager to make sure that people were receiving the right information in the right language that I forgot to introduce myself. So I'm Casey Weston, and I co-lead LinkedIn's Data for Impact program, which is the vehicle through which we share aggregated data and insights at no cost with public partners. So we're all here to think about how we can do that better. Okay, so hopefully by now you've gotten a sense of the power and the opportunity of the data that LinkedIn, Ookla, and GitHub are sitting on, the data that we have and would love to help leverage for public good. Now, with that positive promise, we want to temper it a little bit by talking about some of the challenges of using private sector data. And some of these challenges will be unique to using private sector data at no cost. In the case of LinkedIn, some of them are unique to using data that's produced by members, specific members who have signed up. But we suspect that you would see a lot of these challenges across organizations that you work with. So I encourage you to think about even data that you might be receiving from vendors, and the challenges that you have there might be reflected in this discussion. And of course, I encourage Bridget and Cynthia and Kevin to chime in if any of these challenges are things that resonate with you or not and might be different. So the first challenge that I think we've observed as private sector organizations working with public and civil society organizations in sharing data is the difficulty in launching partnerships. So oftentimes we've identified some amazing partners, like those of you in the workshop today, who are interested in receiving private sector data, but there's limited familiarity within the broader organization, like a statistical authority or a nonprofit, about the power of private sector data and what it can do. And that limited familiarity means that there's a very low risk tolerance for receiving that data, taking the time to learn about it, signing legal agreements necessary to protect it. And so this means, and additionally, there's very concentrated decision making. So even if people like those of you in the room today would be interested in receiving our data at no cost, there might be some person in the legal department who is very good at protecting the organization and isn't necessarily interested or familiar in new sources of data. And so the solutions that we've begun to land on to overcome this challenge really require building long-term relationships and deep trust between organizations. So this requires people like Bridget, Cynthia, Kevin, and I having conversations not only with the really amazing data managers, probably many of you in the room today, but also your legal teams or your governance teams to make sure that they are comfortable with this objective of leveraging private sector data alongside public sector data for the larger good. It also requires really careful attention to something that probably most of us don't love, which is the details of governance and the legal agreements between organizations. These can be very tricky to negotiate at the beginning, but once they do, they provide a clear pathway for how the data can be used, how it can be shared, and the potential that it can have for the organization. So one maybe takeaway or action item for all of us from this is to really take the time to socialize this idea that there's a great potential in using private sector data for public good, and everyone can be made a little bit more aware of that. The second challenge is a little bit of an opportunity, I hope, as well. It's in navigating the differences between the data types. So all of our organizations mention to some degree security or privacy. This may be a little bit less true on the Ookla side, where we're testing things that are public, and probably much more true on the LinkedIn side, where we promise members as soon as they sign in that we won't share their specific data with everyone. So there's a range. But we all, of course, need to protect data and privacy. And this means that oftentimes when we're working with partners like you all who may want very granular data, we're actually not permitted to share the data at the level of granularity that would be desired. The second challenge and the difference between the data is in terms of coverage and representativeness. So none of our organizations, and this again, this probably varies, but I'll take a guess here that none of our organizations have the mission of collecting data only for free use. If we did, we would be nonprofits, and that would be amazing, but we are not. And so what that means is that many of the decisions that we make about where to collect data and how to use that data are driven by the businesses that we work with. As a result, the data is not perfectly unbiased. It's not a perfect sample of the entire universe in all cases. Certainly, we would love for it to be, and we work with many different members of our organizations to increase equity and try to increase the extent to which the data is an unbiased sample, but it's ultimately not. Even government data is often not an unbiased sample. But this means that there are difficulties and challenges in leveraging this data on the public sector side. Alongside this, the taxonomies or measurement tools that we use may vary from those used by governments. And that's because they're driven by business decisions or by the customers that we work with, as opposed to the existing taxonomies that governments use. And again, this varies across organizations. If you're measuring something like internet speed or even energy use, like a utility, the measurements will probably be pretty standardized and be the same. For us at LinkedIn, for example, we're measuring things like occupations and industries, and so our taxonomies can be very different. So some of the solutions that we've identified here are, first of all, technical solutions. We're all working for tech companies, so of course that's our go-to in terms of solutions. Things like differential privacy and data clean rooms can help us protect the privacy and security of data while also making it useful to public sector actors. The second is improving our understanding of data coverage and representativeness by working with partners like you all to validate the data. And so this might mean that we share data with you, you compare it to the data that you have already collected, and we can determine together the extent to which it's representative and covers the population that you're seeking to understand. The third solution is actually to try to help improve the taxonomies and measurement tools that governments use by sharing the taxonomies that we use. So it may be that the fact that we're working with the customers of today means that our taxonomies are actually more applicable to the economic and technological realities of today than the ones that governments use that may have begun decades ago. This is not always true, of course, but it merits a conversation about how the tools that we use can be used better by government partners. The third and final bucket of challenges is in assessing the impact of the data sharing. This is particularly true when companies are sharing data for free. So obviously, if you're working with a vendor that you're paying for data, the impact for them is the money they're receiving from you, and that's that. They're fine. In the case of the organizations you have here today, we do work to share data openly and at no cost with public partners. And this means that we, speaking very frankly, need to justify our work internally to our organizations and show that it's having an impact. This can be tricky because most people, when they're using data, including us, don't necessarily think about reporting back to wherever the data came from and saying, thank you, here's how we used it, here's how it had an impact. So if you use data from your government census, for example. You don't usually then write the Census Bureau and say, hey, here's how I use the data, thanks so much. We're a little bit different in that we really want to hear how you use the data, and we're excited to learn how we can improve the data that we share with you, but also to be able to justify the existence of the types of programs that we work with to share this data for free. And so some of these challenges are around timelines or the familiarity with this follow-up process. And the solutions, I think, there we go, thanks so much. The solutions that we've identified really come back to that first bucket of building meaningful relationships with all of the different stakeholders in your organization. So not only those of you who work with data on a daily basis, but your communications teams, your legal teams, so that we can build a narrative around this public-private partnership that allows it to be as sustainable as possible. The other thing that's very useful is clearly articulating data menus and what we have to offer so that you can anticipate the way that you might use the data ahead of time. And that's why we're going to take some time today to walk through the data sets that we have. I see a great question in a chat. To be standardized data sharing terms. Yes. Yes, exactly. So definitely thinking about open source licensing is an opportunity for some organizations, and I think Ookla and GitHub may be able to speak to that. I think it often depends on the extent to which the business relies on that data for other functions. So LinkedIn really so I can only speak for LinkedIn here. LinkedIn really relies on our data to run the business, and so for us to make it open source would be to like make LinkedIn a nonprofit. And so although I will keep pushing for that internally, I don't think they're going to listen to me anytime soon. But I think that is certainly a solution for many different organizations, and one that should be investigated wherever possible. So the other thing just to flag here is sort of what we're doing today. So thinking about different partnerships that can facilitate meaningful lessons. So Ookla, GitHub, and LinkedIn are members of the Industry Data for Society Partnership, which is a private sector consortium that aims to improve the data sharing process and make data more transparent for the public good. This is what brought us, one thing that brought us together, and why we're here today. We're also all working with the Development Data Partnership, which is a collaboration between international organizations like the World Bank and the IMF and the private sector, particularly tech companies, to make sure that those organizations have access to technology. The amazing partner that brought us together, all of us together today, is essentially the Development Data Partnership, but for the world. So whereas the Development Data Partnership just works with the World Bank and the IMF and these international organizations, the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data has the capacity to work with you all and to broker the really meaningful relationships that we hope to build with you all to use this data for the broader and public good. They have many other functions as well, and I'm sure that you've heard about those, such as the Data Festival, et cetera, but this is one role that we are so grateful to the Global Partnership for playing. So with that, I'll actually pass it back to Cynthia and Kevin at GitHub to walk through some of their data. Please feel free to log your questions in the chat. After they walk through the data, they can respond to some of those questions. The goal of this is really to help you all think about how this data might be useful to you, how you might ingest this data on a regular basis to support your deliverables, your planning processes, the investment processes of your governments, and to increase productivity within your own organizations. So with that, I will go ahead and pass it over to GitHub.
Great. Thanks so much, Casey, and super excited to be here and grateful to give a whirlwind tour of the data that we have on offer here. And go to the next slide. I'm able to control. Oh, great. Sorry, another slide. Thanks. So GitHub, we offer a data product called the Innovation Graph, and this tracks various metrics that are all occur in public software projects on our platform. As Cynthia mentioned, we have a lot of developers on our platform, and as you can imagine, a lot of public software projects there. These are aggregated on a quarterly basis and faceted by economy, which roughly maps to the country level throughout the world. And actually, to Steve's comment in the chat, we are, at GitHub, we are understandably big fans of open source, and that was one of the tacks that we took with the innovation graph. And this data is actually available publicly on our innovation graph repo. And Cynthia just shared the site as well at innovationgraph.github.com. Running through each of these metrics, first we have Git pushes, which is a measure of collaboration volume on GitHub. This is a count of basically code uploads from a software developer sending their code up to a public software repository. And what's a repository? A repository is a software project. Usually each software project is a separate repository, although certainly nuances abound based on what workflow software developers work with. But we also offer repositories as another metric, the count of repositories located within an economy or country per quarter. Next metric we have is about developer accounts. This roughly maps to coders within a country. And these would be personal kind of user accounts or individual user accounts, as opposed to the organizational accounts that we have for companies and groups, which would be comprised of one or more developer accounts. And then the next few metrics, they're a bit more involved. So we have programming languages that are used by developers. And the way we count those are the number of unique developer accounts that uploaded code. So they pushed code to a public repository that contains a particular programming language during that quarter. And then analogously, we have a metric for software licenses. So again, these are the number of unique developers per quarter who uploaded code to a repository that has that license. Topics, similar kind of story, and topics are a special a string, a text field that users can select and tag their projects with. So this would be the number of unique developers who pushed code, uploaded code to a public repository that contains that topic string during that quarter. And then finally, we have a measure of collaboration flows between economies. And I think this is best illustrated by the next slide, where we have a stacked area chart showing inbound collaborators over time to repositories located in Kenya. And we have this separated across economies as well. But as you can see for Q3 2023, the top 3 inbound collaborators, economies that pushed code to repositories located in Kenya. Looks like Nigeria, United States, the United Kingdom, the top kind of portion there. But there have been many code contributions from many other economies as well. And it's some of what we love to see on GitHub, because the software is a team sport, as we all know, and it's just wonderful to see the collaboration happening globally. And then on the next slide, we talk a bit about the limitations when dealing with this data. So of course, our geolocation is based on IP address. And so there are, this will be affected by VPN use. And so there might be systematic biases if certain countries or economies would be more prone to using VPNs. We have a minimum reporting threshold of at least 100 developers per quarter for each activity for privacy reasons. And as a result, the economies with a lower population would be underrepresented in our data set. Again, this only tracks public activity. There are just like very few reasons we ever deal with private repo data. There are narrow legal exceptions when it comes to court orders and the like, but otherwise we basically never touch private data. And then for quarterly data, in terms of time frame, where quarterly data starts from Q1 2020. And on the next slide, we chat a bit about the representativeness, as I alluded to in the previous slide, with the lower population economies. If you check out a README on the GitHub repo, we had this comically large heat map showing the number of metrics each economy appears in over time. And so if you squint real far down into the lighter colored squares, AQ is the 2-letter ISO code for Antarctica. And as you can see, there's not a lot of data we have in Antarctica. If you're doing research on software developers specifically within Antarctica, this is not the data set for you. But for many other economies, we have better coverage. On the next slide, I want to walk through some of our partners that we've collaborated with. When it comes to indices and reports, we have sent data along to the OECD for their policy observatory dashboards, the Stanford AI Index, the LATAM AI Index, and the World Intellectual Property Organizations and Global Innovation Index. On the next slide, we have a slide about the researchers that we collaborate with. Often these would be economists who are measuring and quantifying the economic impact of open source software, and I would invite you to check those out at your leisure. But for this workshop, I really wanted to focus on a kind of a where the rubber meets the road kind of example. If you advance a couple of slides here with the case study, this is more of a supposed a cautionary tale because for completely understandable reasons, there's been confusion around our developers metric, and we really need to clarify that. But this is one small step toward that. So our developers metric shows a count of cumulative developer counts per economy, and so this is not just a measure of active developers within a quarter. This also includes inactive accounts. But often you might want to do research that uses the active developers within a country within a particular period, right? And so one way you could actually do that, next slide, is actually through our languages metric, which might sound a bit surprising. But so as I mentioned before, programming languages, this shows the number of unique developers per quarter who uploaded code to a public repo containing that language. And so if you were to use the num pushers column there, you can see like this is a measure of active developers, like a slice of active developers who worked within that language basically during that time frame. And so for example, if you wanted to, in the next slide, do something silly, like with the World Happiness Report that recently came out, you wanted to compare the ranking between the World Happiness rank for a particular country against the JavaScript pushers per quarter per capita for an economy. You could set up a chart like this. On the x-axis, you can see the rank of the JavaScript pushers per capita, and on the y-axis, you can see the rank of happiness. Your initial takeaway, if like me, might have been one of surprise, because as in my personal experience, and this might be true for you as well, the more JavaScript that I write, the sadder I become. So this just doesn't really make sense. But if you were to go to the next slide and fill in by continent, it's clear that we also need a control for per capita income as well. And so all that to say, this is one way you could use our programming languages data to get at active developer counts so that you can explore much more important and interesting questions about correlations and causations than I've presented here. But with that, I wanted to turn it over to Q&A if anyone had some questions. And maybe, yeah, looks like Cynthia also in the chat. All right, but happy to take any questions if folks have them.
Kevin, whenever I don't get questions, I just trust that means I've done an amazing job explaining exactly what the data set can offer. With that, though, I would encourage any of the partners in the room to please feel free to throw a question in the chat. I'm not sure if you can unmute, but hopefully through translation, if necessary, we're able to kind of get your questions. Lynette and Anita, if you know of any other issues that may be preventing us from getting questions, please flag those. But otherwise, we can give a second for folks to raise any questions they may have about how some of this data could be used within the statistical authorities or the nonprofits or other organizations that they work with.
Yeah, thanks, Casey. I'm manning the Q&A, and I for sure do not see a question yet, but I think we can move, and I'm sure the colleagues who are on the call might add something as we're moving forward. Thank you. And
Thanks.
for anyone who's not clear about how to add the questions, there is a Q&A button at the top. I don't think that they're able to unmute themselves, where you can type in the questions as you get them, and then we'll queue them for the end. Thanks. I'll be back.
Right. With that, then we'll pass it back to Bridget to do a data overview of UCLA's data.
Yeah, sounds great. So for our time today, just with the limited time we have today, I decided that the best option for what sect of UCLA data to focus on would probably be speed test data. At UCLA for Good, it just tends to be the data set that gets most requested. It is also just the one that people tend to recognize the most as well. So rather than getting into the weeds of, background scans and QoE, we can just dive into speed test. So I'll give an overview of the data and how, as a commercial company whose data is our bread and butter, we go about offering this to people on a complementary basis. But before that, I wanted to define a couple terms because I'm going to be launching into a lot of internet jargon in the next couple minutes. So I just wanted to make sure that we are all on the same page with aggregates. With our speed test data, it can be aggregated over a location, time period, internet provider, and it results in a single metric or single value for a given metric. Fixed refers to fixed data. It's an internet measurement delivered through a fixed line that connects to a provider's network of cables. Basic definition is that it's Wi-Fi. It's the internet that you plug into the wall. And it's one of two major services that we divide our metrics into, and the other is mobile. Kilobits per second and megabits per second tend to be how we measure upload and download speeds. We measure latency in milliseconds. And then obviously mobile is the other metric. It is tests. It originates from tests taken on a cell phone app. All right, so now that's out of the way, we can dive into what speed test intelligence is. It is the summation of all of our consumer-initiated tests taken every day on speed test. These are a couple of ways that it has been very helpful for government and regulatory bodies. They tend to use speed test intelligence as an official source of record for state of worldwide markets. And for our commercial customers, it is a very useful tool to derive insights on for deriving insights into understanding digital infrastructure. Next slide, please. So for UCLA for Good, we actually make this data available through a publicly available open data set. And looking at Steve's comments in the chat, that's going to be exciting to get to, as it is not technically open data because it is under a commercial or Creative Commons license. But yes, it shows download, upload, and latency speeds on a global level. And it shows mobile and fixed breakouts. And so this slide kind of shows a little bit more of an overview of what the data set is offering. It goes back to Q1 2019 to our mostly recently completed quarter, which is Q4 2023, and in a couple weeks, Q1 2024 will be added. And these metrics previously mentioned are aggregated on a quarterly level, and they're aggregated into tiles that are around 600 by 600-ish meters at the equator. And I will drop a link at the end of this to our GitHub page, which has a lot of documentation on tutorials, how to download and access this data if you want to check it out for yourself. And I will also give a link to this nice map here that is an overview of this quarter's round of data, so you can kind of get a visualization of it. Next slide, please. Yeah, so moving on to kind of applications of this open data. University of Chicago a couple years back used it to identify digital inequities within Chicago. They made a really cool dashboard. Next slide, please. And then also University of California, Santa Barbara used our open data to research internet inequities across all US states, so they could contextualize our crowdsourced measurements. And then one of our partners, the OECD, used our open data to improve broadband access and address digital deserts across a multitude of countries. Next slide, please. And then I wanted to move on to kind of the limitations of this data set, because as Casey pointed out earlier, as a commercial company, we also need to be sure that we're not harming the commercial side of our business. Even though we want to provide our data openly, we also have to take into account what is going to lose us money. So like I said before, this is under a Creative Commons license, so the data can't be used for commercial purposes. And then also, it is not as granular as some of our other more enterprise commercial data sets. It's on a quarterly aggregated basis. It's in tiles. And part of that is for privacy reasons, as Casey mentioned. That's something that companies need to take into account. But also part of it is we need to protect our sales, and that is unfortunately to the detriment of some important research questions. So sometimes this open data, even though I think it is useful and we wanted to create a data set that is useful, it sometimes isn't the best for answering certain questions, such as technology breakouts or operator breakouts, because operators tend to be our clients. But that's not the only way that we offer our data. We also will do case-by-case research projects with partners. We tend to do these under a public interest research license, basically just saying this is the use case, this is the country or countries or cities that you want data for, this is what the use is, and these are the metrics you want. And if those goals align with our own, we are more than happy to look into providing additional data that is not publicly available. Next slide, please. So this is not like a once in a while use case for us. We've partnered with over 100 academics, nonprofits, and organizations since 2019. This is not a comprehensive list here, but these are a couple of notable partners that we've partnered with. And also, as Casey mentioned, the Development Data Partnership is what binds us all together here. And through our collaborations with them, we've been able to offer them data that has been used in sectors like COVID-19, assessing poverty, digital development, social development, school connectivity, and many, many more sectors. And then so to dive into a couple last use cases here, World Bank used our data to analyze the digital infrastructure adoption of non-pharmaceutical interventions during the COVID-19 pandemic in Latin American countries. And they had some really interesting findings from that, and they showed how the role that internet connection speeds played in poor access and low speed connectivity might increase more vulnerable health to shock, and be more likely that if you have poor internet, then you're more likely to be needing to go out somewhere to travel, and that is putting more of a detriment to your health. So it was a really interesting research project, and we were happy to collaborate with them, and that our data was used in such interesting findings. Another use case was the IMF used our data to examine digitalization and household resilience to COVID-19 in sub-Saharan Africa. These are some of our major findings. Access to 3G and 4G networks seem to increase the likelihood of small holder farms selling crops to market by 16%. Access to 3G or 4G network would increase the likelihood of starting a family business for additional income by 5%. Waged workers who had access to 3G and 4G is 5% to 16% more likely to stay employed during the pandemic. Is that the last slide? Yeah, must be. So yeah, just to close out, even though that there are challenges with providing private sector data on our end, and it's also hard to get the metrics that people need for these important research questions, we are always interested in creative ways that we can provide data and work with people to make these impacts.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bridget. I see a couple questions in the Q&A. Maybe just to give the four of us from the tech orgs a quick break in talking. We can kind of, well, I don't know if it'll be a break in talking because we're answering the questions, but from our slides at least. There were two questions from Ruiz. One was about working with statistical institutions, and I can talk about that in a second. And of course, Cynthia, Kevin, Bridget, if you have responses, I think there's a way to respond via message or vocally as well. What I will say before talking about how LinkedIn has done this is that we have worked, all of us have worked substantially really with the World Bank, OECD, and these organizations because we had the development data partnership to help us work with those orgs. It was a facilitating organization. Working with national statistical authorities, there's hundreds really, right? And especially if you think about LinkedIn would also be interested in working with labor ministries. UCLA and GitHub might be interested in working with tech agencies, whatever the national agency is for tech, science, et cetera. And so there's just too many for us to coordinate with in a one-off way. And that may be one reason why we don't have as many examples of collaborating directly with national statistic institutions. That's one reason why we're bringing this group together, thanks to the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. They're eager to help be that broker to facilitate more work with national statistical authorities. So I will give an example from LinkedIn in a second, but I think that's one of our goals here is to bring some of these collaborations that we've successfully had with the World Bank and OECD to national governments. The second question that you had was a great one, asking about the incentives for companies looking to collaborate with private institutions. I think Steve in the other chat was talking about how we're sort of data philanthropies. I don't know what my communications team would say about that, but I think it's a decent explanation. And essentially, I don't want to speak for GitHub and UCLA, but I'll let you all co-sign or not. But we're sitting on a lot of data. And we know that if we just only used it for our own commercial purposes, someone would probably say, hey, what's going on? That's like, in some ways, that's an asset that has been sourced from a lot of people, and it is benefiting those people. That's why they share it. But it's also something that you could use to benefit the world. So just by making sure that the data is used, I think that's the incentive. What that means, though, is that if we share, sometimes I work with a few organizations where I share data on a monthly basis, which takes time for me to pull the data, check it, put it in an Excel spreadsheet, send it, make sure I've done that for all the orgs, and then it goes into a black box. I never know if it's used or not. And so after a while, I have to be like, hey, does it matter that I'm doing this? And so for me personally, as well as for LinkedIn, the incentive is to understand, is that data being used to inform policy, monitoring, awareness, anything that's a public good? Because if not, then sort of what's the point? I'm not sure if Kevin, Bridget, or Cynthia, if you have any other thoughts on those, but those were good questions from Luis.
Yeah, thanks so much, Casey. And yeah, I feel like GitHub, we had GitHub, or at least I had GitHub, would very much plus one everything you said, and particularly when it comes to opening up uses of these data to anyone who just has the curiosity to try different analyses. We have a very, I think we use the data to try to improve our service as much as we can, and we offer a lot of free services on our platform to empower developers to collaborate with each other. But at the same time, I guess one of our aims is to make more visible the contributions to software when it comes to contributions to the economy. Often innovation and like GDP impact for intellectual property kind of works. Those are generally quantified using patents and like scientific research publications, and I think those are great. But there's this kind of just this dark matter when it comes to software contributions historically, and we'd love to change that because well, at least we believe that these are valuable contributions that people are making when it comes to advancing knowledge within the world and using that for valuable purposes. And so it'd be wonderful to kind of uplift the work that everyone is doing on a global basis in collaboration with each other. I think that'd just be beautiful.
Ruiz, I think Kevin just gave you some homework, which is to make sure that your statistical agency is now tracking developer uses, because it's a critical driver of economic growth, development, and activity, and it might be one that the agency is not currently tracking. So let's make that collaboration happen. All right, so thank you all. I know this has been, we've been like throwing a lot of information at you very quickly. Oh, Bridget, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, I see a question for me in there.
Go ahead.
Yeah, the FCC gave us a new definition of broadband by raising the standards to 100 millibits per second download. What does it mean for partners in developing countries? Obviously, this is just an opinion, my own opinion here, but we aren't instilling any metrics on any country or trying to say something's wrong or right, but we do firmly believe in supporting good digital infrastructure. So I think it's ultimately a good thing that they're pushing for higher download speed, but it's also interesting just because already this is obviously US based, but in the US a lot of places are still behind even 100 megabits per second. So it's I don't know really what it means, but I hope it means that there are more driving forces to improve digital infrastructure. And I will leave it at that.
Okay, I see some other questions, really great questions in the chat. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to try to run through some of the LinkedIn data sets and see if I can touch on some of those points. And then I'll leave some time at the end for additional questions. So I spoke a little bit before about where LinkedIn's data comes from, which is the 1 billion users that we have on our platform. This allows us to share a menu of data offerings. To be honest, there's like a menu, and then there's a sort of secret menu, and it's not intentionally secret. It's just that we are, as a business and with the research side of our business, is constantly producing new analyses and new data. And so there are cuts of data that are very unique thematically or regionally, that I'm hesitant to add to the main data menu because they may or may not be available all the time or for all regions. It's another challenge in navigating the data differences, right, between administrative data sets that are consistent over time and private sector ones that may vary widely. So we do have some other data sets on the menu, and that just speaks to the difficulty of maintaining a data menu, but I'll walk through these very quickly. We can share information with government partners and civil society on first the hiring activity, specifically the hiring by industry and by country. And this allows economists and statistical authorities to think about how the economy is doing, where it is changing, where it's going up and going down. We can talk about gender representation, often at the industry level and even at the seniority level. So we can say, there may be gender equity at the industry level, but when we look at different seniorities, there's a gender gap for managers. We can talk about career transitions, so the extent to which people are moving from one industry towards another, which allows economists and demographers, development specialists to think about where industrial shifts are happening, which industries are declining in a particular country and which are growing. And finally, and one of our most important data sets is around skills. So we can understand the skills that are most critical for a specific occupation or industry. This also allows us to compare countries in terms of their use of specific types of skills. These might be skills required for the green transition, AI literacy skills or AI engineering skills, other disruptive tech skills like machine learning or drone development. And this can then inform program design or investments that training organizations or labor ministries might make. We can break all of this data down by country. In certain countries, we can break it down subnationally, so India, Germany, US, UK. We can break it down by industry, 20 specific industries. These do not align to the International Industrial Standard, which is tricky, but there is a crosswalk that can make that happen. And for many of these, we can talk about the different skill groups I mentioned: green skills, digital skills, AI skills, etc. Some of the limitations that I've already mentioned before, one is privacy, and that comes up in two ways. First, we don't actually use IP addresses because sometimes the data can get too granular. So unlike GitHub's data where there's a certain level of aggregation that protects it, we're working with members' specific names and job descriptions, et cetera. So to use the IP address data would be a little tricky. And that means that if someone says that they're working in New York, where I'm based, then we believe they're working in New York, even if they're based in Antarctica, to use Kevin's example. The second is that there are minimum thresholds. So if we do not have enough data on career transitions between the manufacturing industry and the healthcare industry in South Sudan, which is a request that I've actually received, there might be only one or two people that we have on our platform that have made that transition in South Sudan. And so we can't share the data because we would be revealing a little too much about those one or two people. And so it's very important to us to protect the privacy. We're happy to do that, but as was alluded to before, it might mean that certain data sets are not available. The second, as I mentioned before, is representativeness. So of course, if you're using LinkedIn, you're more likely to have internet access. It's true that people using LinkedIn are more likely to work in tech-enabled industries and live in higher income places, but we are working to make the platform more inclusive. There are a whole set of other programs that are devoted to that, and that means that slowly our data is becoming more representative. The final limitation is that our data says much more about labor supply than labor demand. This is actually useful for some statistical organizations who are interested in understanding the total working population. But if you're an economist trying to understand the jobs that are in highest demand right now, we can share a little bit about that, but it's not as much as we can share about the labor supply. So because of the issues that I mentioned before, our country coverage is a little spotty, particularly in emerging markets. It's growing quickly. So even since this map was made, we've added 6 different countries. So that's a challenge for us. That said, just because we don't have a full data set in the country that you live or work in doesn't mean that our data can't be useful. So if you're trying to understand the critical skills for a software engineer or a data analyst or a nurse or administrative assistant, how much will those skills required vary between, let's say, Nigeria and Gabon? They might, or they might not, right? And so we were happy to share data for analog countries or benchmark countries to then help our partners estimate what might be true for their specific region. In terms of representativeness, we've done an analysis with the World Bank. This was now 8 years ago, so a long time ago, that showed how representative our data is by industry and country group. So we're happy to provide this to serve as a guide. Our data has only become more representative since then because our platform has doubled and most of that growth is outside of the United States and Europe. So we were getting more representative, but there's a ways to go. All right, so how has this data been used? There are sort of 3 different ways that we typically work with partners. One is to do really in-depth collaboration where we create something new together. An example of this is working with Germany's leading labor market think tank to create a new indicator that assessed the likelihood of someone to make a career transition from industry A to industry B. And this is used by economists to predict what industrial changes may be happening in the economy. This is really resource intensive, and so our data science team can only handle 1 or 2 of these types of projects a year. It's much more common that we work on an inform model, meaning we receive a request for a specific project, and we respond to that request with the data from the data menu. So an example of this was the World Bank doing a planning strategy for Costa Rica, for Turkey, for Argentina, where they wanted to understand a little bit more about gender equity and green skills in those different labor markets. We said, great, we'll supply you with the data. And they use that data to inform their country economic planning strategy that then shaped the investments made in those countries. The final model, and the model that might be most interesting for you all, is the integrate model, where we share data on a monthly basis on things like the hiring rate or the share of hires that are women in a specific industry. We share this type of data with the German Statistical Authority, who has then validated it to understand how applicable it is to their economy. We share it with the Federal Reserve here in the United States. We also share it with the Inter-American Development Bank, and we'd be happy to think about how we can share it with some of the statistical agencies on the call today, to the extent that it's useful, and to do a validation exercise to say, how representative is this data? And then if it is, can we use it to be a faster, more efficient way of collecting this data on a monthly basis? Very quickly, the way that we sort of process this data is to receive a request from you. I typically walk through and make sure that I understand the real goal of the project or the need, and then I can do a good job of mapping to the data that we have available to serve that request. I then liaise and negotiate with the data science team to get that data. If it's approved, I pass it along, and then I follow up to make sure that that it's used, or if it's not used, why it wasn't used and how we can improve to make that a little bit better. Lorenz, I noted your question about the decisions that we make to publish which data sets. They're informed largely by privacy, but also because the use cases are a little bit different. So some of the data sets that I mentioned before, like the hiring rate at the industry level in, let's say, Kenya, most of our customers don't really care. They're interested in something like, where can they find a person with software engineering skills in Nairobi, right? What company has those skills and where can they poach from? Because they're doing recruiting. So we are actually able to differentiate based off of the types of users. And when we're working with governments, we want to be as supportive as possible. And so sharing that high level data allows us to add it to our menu more effectively. With that, though, I'll pause. I think we have a few minutes left. I know we wanted to leave like 5 minutes at the end for some closing by the Global Partnership, but eager to know if there are additional questions that we can help address.
I see Anita wants to come in, but also there are some questions on the Q&A, Casey, and we can make the closing very short so that we address the questions. Anita, do you want to come in?
Oh, sorry, I did that by mistake, but I will want
Okay.
to come after we finish with the questions to discuss the poll.
Yes, yeah, for the closing poll, that's fine. Over back to you, Casey, with the questions.
Thanks. I see Cynthia and Bridget have chimed in on a few of them. Is there data that you can't include on the menu at all? Definitely. And usually that's privacy. It's also sometimes commercial. The other challenge I wanted to raise in creating a comprehensive data menu is that there are so many potential cuts of the data. So it's and we have not checked and reviewed them all. So if I have not yet worked with a partner in Nigeria, for example. And so I don't know exactly what's available in Nigeria until I try to pull all of that data. But you might imagine I showed you 5 indicators. There are probably 10 more talking about like the rate of growth of green skills or the fastest growing AI skills, things like that. I haven't checked all of that data for Nigeria, so I don't know if it's there. I would know generally in an initial conversation if it might be there or might be useful, but before I can promise it, I have to go and pull all that data and review it. And so to do that for every country in the world without knowing that there's demand for it is a huge task, and we can't do that. So it requires the conversation first with partners to assess demand. I think we might be through all of the questions. One thing I'll do, since my colleagues have already done this, is throw into the chat the website for Data for Impact, and encourage you all to get in touch. We'd love to think about how we can support the amazing and important work that you all do for your governments and the civil society organizations that you work with. So please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. And I believe we can work with the Global Partnership to share some version of this presentation, if not all of it, with you all afterwards. I think those are all the questions in the chat. Being on time is rare, so I will take it as a positive and maybe pass it back to you, Anita.
Yeah, thank you, Casey. Anita, over to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for such a lovely and very informative presentation, Casey, Bridget, Kevin, and Cynthia. Before we close, and I know yeah, it's a bit rare for us to be closing early, I'm just going to put in the chat we'd like to hear more from you on how you thought the session went, or if there are areas of improvement, especially since this is something new we're starting, especially in terms of privately sourced data. So we'd love to hear your thoughts on this. So I'll be putting in the chat some a few questions in English, French, and Spanish. And if you can kindly fill them out, it won't take more than 5 minutes to do so. With that, I'll hand over to Lynette.
Great, thank you, Anita. So do we give a few minutes for the survey?
Yes, we can give a few minutes. Also, as you close, we can also be filling that out.
Yeah, great. Perfect. I'm going to unfortunately keep my camera off, so I'm not freezing all over the place. My internet is not so great. Yeah, no, this has been amazing. Thank you so much, Casey, Kevin, Bridget, Cynthia. Thank you for sharing your insights and for also being open to share the data that you have and that can be shared with the partners. I know that we will get some requests on this and we'll be passing them along. So we would like to thank all the participants for coming and spending the past 1 hour 24 minutes with us. It's been great, and it's always amazing to just learn new things and to also hear about the potential of what exists out there. So this is not the end. I know that we will be coming back to you to have more conversations and to move this forward. And generally, to the IDSP partners, we would like to thank you for taking your time to prepare for this, taking your time to share your wisdom and to share the information that you also have, and of course being very willing to open this up to our partners as well. So with that, I would like to call the meeting to an end. Have a lovely rest of your day and great weekend in a day. Great.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, bye.